Mrs. Aruna Balachandran, Research Scholar and Teaching Fellow, Department of English, College of Engineering, Anna University, Chennai. She has 6 years of experience in teaching. She did MA MPhil in English Literature.
Welcome to UGC Lecture Series. The topic for today's discussion is on communication skills. The content, what we are going to see in the next half an hour session is about the language, the definition of language, the different types. Then we come to the components of language, what is communication and what are the process that involves in communication, the different forms of communication, what are the barriers to communication. Next, what is the relationship between language and communication, and then an overall summary and the possible questions that you would get in this session. Definition. When we come to the topic or when we come to the term definition, there are a lot of definitions for language, but I think this is one definition which is an apt definition which is given by Edward Sapir in the book Language: An Introduction to the Study of Speech. Language is a purely human and non-instinctive method of communicating ideas, emotions and desires by means of voluntarily produced symbols. So it is not only ideas, it is also the emotions and the desires by means of symbols also. When it comes to communicating, I think the most sophisticated human skill is language. We rely on language most probably. No other skill is actually relied on by the human beings for communication other than language. Coming to the most important part of the session, what is language? First and foremost, we need to know what is language. So it is a system of communication, and this system of communication can either be through speaking or writing. When it comes to speaking or writing, it is the ability to exchange knowledge, beliefs, ideas, opinions, threats, etc. All these ability to exchange all these ideas is known as language. And communication through arbitrary signals like voice sounds, gestures or written symbols. So language, it doesn't stop with only communicating or exchanging of informations and ideas, but it is also through sounds, gestures or written symbols also. When we come to two types of language, we have two types, those are linguistic and non-linguistic. So what is linguistic? What do you understand by the term linguistic? It is actually communication by means of a language. And non-linguistic is communication by smiling, shouting, laughing, that is non-verbal terms, non-verbal communication. All these comes under non-linguistic type. Next, components of language. When you're talking about the components, you understand it is the different types or the different parts of a language. So we know that language is a complex form of communication. So what are the different components which combine to form a language? They are the speech sounds, written symbols, words and syntax. So all these are the components, all these are the ingredients of a language. Linguistics, the term linguistics, we have been talking about linguistics for the past 2 or 3 minutes, but what do we know about linguistics? Linguistics is actually the study of a language. The entire concept of studying a language is known as linguistics. Now, what is communication? So we know the word has been, the etymology of the word is from a Latin word called communico or communicare, which means to share. So from the idea. From the word itself, we can understand that it is an exchange of information, ideas, feelings and emotions also. And the main purpose of communication is to get one's message across to the other. So, your main purpose of communicating with a third person or another person is to get your message in a very clear manner to the other person. So, this act of transferring information from one place to another is called communication. And in communication, the process it involves in the sender and the receiver. So, there are two things which are most important while communicating. One is the sender, the other one is the receiver. So, communication is considered as successful when both sides perceive in the same way. It involves the transmission and reception of messages. So, communication is what? The transmission from the sender to the receiver, and when the receiver receives it in a proper way and in a clarified, most clear way, it is known as communication. And for communication, it at least involves in two people. There should be at least two people or more for communicating. So, when you come to this slide, process of communication, when you look at this slide, the most important here to understand the entire process of communication, you can look at this picture which is given here. There is a source, then the message is encoded, it is sent through a channel, it is decoded by the receiver, and then the receiver gives a feedback to the sender. That is the source. So, if you see the entire process of communication, it involves in 3 to 4 process, where the information is encoded first, it is channeled, it is sent through the receiver and it is received, and then a feedback is given. Source or the sender is the giver of the message. Encoding, it means the process of converting the thought to message. Channel, it is the medium through which the message travels. Decoding, it means before receiving the message, it has to be translated into a form where the receiver can understand the message in a clear way. Receiver, it is the object who receives the message. Feedback, a check on how successful your message has been transmitted, whether the receiver has received the message in the same way that you thought it would have traveled or not. Now, forms of communication. There are different forms of communication. When we talk about the forms of communication, you have the verbal communication, non-verbal communication, interpersonal, intrapersonal, mass communication, media communication, extrapersonal. All of us, we would have heard about this verbal communication, non-verbal communication, interpersonal, intrapersonal. But coming to the last three, we wouldn't have heard much about it. So, we will be looking into all these forms of communication. Under verbal communication, you have two types. One is the oral and the written communication. So, oral communication, it refers to the speaking. Written communication, it refers to the writing. Verbal communication, the using of language as a vehicle for communication. So, in verbal communication, by the term verbal, you understand it mainly refers to speaking. So, here language is used as a vehicle for communication, and there are two types. One is the written communication and oral communication. Oral communication, so it is a face-to-face interaction between the sender and receiver. So, when the sender and receiver are face-to-face and there is an interaction between them, then it is known as oral communication. So, this type of communication can actually have more than two people present. It can be just two people, or it can be a group of members, or it can be a group of 4 to 6 members also. Example, presentations, speeches, group discussions, interviews. So, all these things like presentations and speeches, all these have the oral communication. Now coming to the written communication, the sender, he uses the written mode to send the message. So you need to know the difference between the oral communication and written communication. In oral communication, there is a face-to-face interaction between the sender and the receiver. Whereas in written communication, the sender actually uses the written mode to send the message. For example, reports, proposals, books, emails, letters, project reports, all these will come under written communications, like your CV, resume, statement of purpose, all these would come under written communication. Now coming to non-verbal communication. From the very term non-verbal, you understand that it is something not related to the verbal aspect. The message is clearly communicated without using a word. So there is no word uttered here. And this requires non-verbal cues for transmitting and receiving the message. So the requirements here are, it involves the transmission of information by means of other than language which is not in the spoken or the written form. Paralanguage, you have a part of it known as the paralanguage, whereas verbal signals are needed to receive and be interpreted. Identifies the non-linguistic aspects, the tone, the pause of the speaker, everything has been identified there as the non-linguistic aspects. So here if you see an example I've given, thanks, gratitude and sarcasm, it depends on the tone. The way a person tells thanks, that tells you whether it is a sense of gratitude or is he saying it in a sarcastic way. So the tone refers to the different aspects or the different style in what he is willing to say, whether he is saying it as a gratitude or whether he is saying it in a sarcastic tone. So that is known as a paralanguage. There are two more categories. One is the body language, where you have all the aspects of personal appearance, walk, gestures, facial expressions, hand movements, eye contact, posture. So when you come to body language, personal appearance, it is your way of dressing. It comes with your way of dressing, the accessories you wear, all these things all come under your personal experience. Walk, the way you walk, gestures, your hand movements, the gestures, whatever you do, the way you sit, the way you stand, the way you answer, the way you ask questions, clarifications, all these come under gestures. Facial expressions, the facial expressions you show of anger, happiness, sadness, all these also are body language. Hand movements, eye contact, posture, the way you sit, stand, all these during a presentations, all these will take part when you are doing a presentations, in group discussions, in the oral communication. There are some paralinguistic features also, which are the voice, volume, pitch, articulation, pauses, voice modulation, etc. So if you see here the voice, if you want to talk about something which is very soft, you need to have a low tone. If you want to say something which is of a high matter, which is of a very good or a very drastic kind of changes, then you need to have a high voice. So the way you raise your voice and lower your volume and all these things, they are known as the paralinguistic features. It depends upon the topic you are talking about. If you're talking about a very subtle topic, your volume and your voice will be very low. If you're talking about a debate, if it's a debatable topic, if it is about a controversial topic and all, then your volume and your voice would naturally raise. So all these are known as the paralinguistic features. Proxemics. So proxemics is actually the study of distance between the speaker and the listener. So all these things would be under when you are doing a PowerPoint presentations. So here the study of distance between the speaker and the listener. Every listener should have a personal space. It's not necessary that the speaker should always stand next to the listener while taking the presentations. So the distance predicts the nature of social relationship that exists between them. Next is body language, as I previously said. The clothes, the color of clothes that you're wearing during presentations, even that matters. Voice, pitch, tone, eye contact. So eye contact should be with everyone in the class or in the auditorium. Whenever you are addressing a larger group, make sure you have an eye contact with everyone in the auditorium. It's not that you should have eye contact only with a particular group of people. Now, coming to intrapersonal communication. So here, intrapersonal, from the term intrapersonal, we understand that it is the communication that takes place within oneself. So this implies individual reflection, contemplation, meditation. So example, if you can say, is transcendental communication. So this also encompasses communicating with the divine and with spirits in the form of prayers, rituals and rites. So when someone is communicating within oneself, when you are introspecting within yourself, contemplating within yourself, meditation, all these refer to intrapersonal communication. Interpersonal communication. So this is direct, written or oral communication between two or more people. The process of sending and receiving information between two people. So it is either direct, it is either written or an oral communication which happens between this group of people. And when you come to the interpersonal communication, there are four basic components. So again, here you have the sender, the message, the medium and the receiver. So for a communication to happen, we can clearly know that these four basic components are the most important ones. You should have a sender, the message, the medium and the receiver. Now, there are different types of communication that is based on the number of participants actually. So, looking at this, if you see dyadic communication. So, when you look at dyadic communication, it is communication within two people. That is, for example, it may be between the student and the teacher, and where the feedback is maximum here. The next type of communication is group communication. So when you look at group communication, the participants here are more than 3 and we will not get an individual feedback, whereas it's just a general feedback that we get. The third type of communication is a public communication, where it involves a large number of participants, and here the feedback is very minimal. And if you see, for example, it is like the entertainment purposes, whereas the feedback would not be given on an individual basis. It is very minimal there. So these three are the different types of communications which is based on the number of participants. Extrapersonal communication. So can communication exist without language? So we would definitely be targeted with the question, do animals also communicate? Yes, communication with non-human entities, dolphins, animals also communicate. Like for example, if you see here, dogs and cats, they also communicate. They obey the orders by wagging their tails. Okay, so it's not only human beings who communicate, it's also communication is between non-human entities and even animals. Mass communication. So this is conveying the messages to an entire populace, that is to a large amount of audience, to a large race. So here it is through books, televisions, radios, cinema, film, internet, etc. So when a message is conveyed to an entire populace, to an entire nation, to an entire crowd, then it is known as mass communication. Media communication. So communication happens through electronic media like computer, cell phones, LCD, video, etc. So when communication is happening through gadgets, electronic media, electronic gadgets, then we call it as media communication. So whenever there is a positive to communication, we know there is a negative side. There are some barriers to communication. Now what are those barriers to the communication? We have verbal barriers, non-verbal barriers, listening barriers, physical and mechanical barriers, psychological barriers. So we'll be looking into each now. Verbal barriers. So this is lack of proper planning. So when we don't plan properly, when we don't think before speaking or writing, there is no clarity and there is a communication breakdown. Next, when the selection of a wrong variety of language, when you don't know a particular language and you don't know how to use it in an appropriate places, then again there is a improper planning there. The lawyer, argumentative skills, he's got a lot of argumentative skills, but he cannot use it to his wife to get a cup of tea. So if he's going to use his argumentative skills in a place which is not applicable to his skill, then there is no use of having the particular communication. So badly encoded or wrongly decoded message. When the sender sends a message and the receiver receives a message, but he receives it in a different way, he decodes it in a different way, then again there is a communication breakdown. So if you read this example, the manager of Sieve Internationals refers to the report submitted by his marketing trainee as bombastic. The young amateurish employee with a limited vocabulary assumes from the form of the word that it must mean something like fantastic and burst into a grateful thank you very much, sir. But when you see the message there, it actually, the word bombastic is a very sarcastic way the boss has said, but the employee has misinterpreted it. Next is the semantic gap. Message may be interpreted differently by different people. There is a variation in language also. The use of British and American terms. Like sidewalk is used in the US, whereas in UK it is known as pavement, in India it is known as platform. So the use of different words also causes a breakdown in language. Now coming to non-verbal barriers. The clash of verbal and non-verbal messages, receivers trust the non-verbal messages. When there is a verbal and non-verbal message, receivers, they most probably rely on the non-verbal. Rolling of eyes, quick movements, slow movements, avoiding eye contact, all these things show a non-verbal barriers. So awkward gestures, when you have hands inside the pocket, all these give you a wrong signal to the audience. Listening barriers. When you talk about listening, you require a lot of concentration, focus and patience, and you should make the speaker feel he or she is wasting the time. So when you make the speaker feel like that, then there is a barrier there. Getting distracted very easily, getting ahead of the speaker and talking, interruptions, forgetting what is discussed, asking too many questions for the sake of probing, all these things are listening barriers. Physical and mechanical barriers. So physical and mechanical barriers are like the closed doors, the physical distance, the disturbances in the transmission channels, next the poor printing, small fonts, crowded paragraphs, all these are during your presentations, lack of space and margins, erratic functioning of machines, faulty systems. So the failure of microphone mainly during a speech, where all of us would have faced this sometime. Psychological barriers are something which is related very emotional. Either can be the fear, it can be the absent-mindedness, the lack of interest or multiple distractions. So the receiver, he receives the message and since he is in an emotional turmoil, he is not able to interpret it correctly. So is there a relationship between language and communication? Humans communicate with a language and language not only the means of communication. So when speaking of communication, we always associate it with language. So being able to communicate effectively is the most important of all life skills. So this quote has to be remembered by all of us. If you want to communicate effectively, you need to know the importance of it and the benefits of it. You need to clearly convey your message. The summary of the entire portion that we have seen now is what is language, what does it include, the rules and regulations of the symbols and meanings, communications, the transferring of information from one place to another, then the 4 elements of communication, which we say as the sender, receiver, message, medium. What are the different categories? The verbal, non-verbal, interpersonal, intrapersonal. Then what are the barriers to communication? Next, if you see, these are the possible questions that can come from this topic. So the definition of language, definition of communication. So what is communication? Explain the process and elements of communication. Explain what is formal communication and explain what is informal communication. Then how do we overcome the barriers to communication? And is there a difference between language and communication? So when you look at all these, there are possible questions. Thank you.